Amara Jenkins stepped across the threshold of the Sterling residence and into a world of beautiful, silent chaos. The living room, a cavernous space of glass and steel overlooking the rain-slicked Seattle skyline, was a battlefield. But the casualties were not soldiers. They were the artifacts of a life of exquisite taste. Shards of a porcelain vase lay scattered across the polished concrete floor like fallen petals. Cushions, once artfully arranged on a leather sofa, had been gutted, their downy feathers drifting through the air like a gentle, surreal snowfall. And at the epicenter of the destruction, a grand piano, a magnificent Steinway that gleamed under the recessed lighting, was being systematically desecrated. 3 identical 6-year-old boys were the agents of this chaos. They weren't merely playing, they were performing a ritual of rage. One of them, his small face a mask of furious concentration, was clawing at the piano's keys, producing a discordant, painful shriek of sound. Another was tearing pages of sheet music into confetti, letting the notes rain down around him. The third, the one who seemed to be the leader, was using a small, heavy toy truck to hammer at the piano's elegant, curved leg. Amara stood motionless in the entryway, the overnight bag containing her few belongings still clutched in her hand. The agency had warned her. They had called the Sterling Triplets a challenge. 17 nannies in 6 months. They had said, a litany of defeated professionals who had fled the mansion, whispering stories of uncontrollable, almost feral children. The lead boy, his dark curls matted with sweat, finally noticed her. His blue eyes, and startling and exact replica of the other 2, narrowed with a venom that was chilling in a child so young. "Go away," he screamed, his voice raw. He hurled the toy truck, not at her, but at the wall beside her, where it left a sickening, spiderweb crack in the plaster. Like the others did, his brothers stopped their own acts of destruction, turning to form a small, defiant phalanx behind him. They were a united front of grief and anger. 3 small bodies braced against a world that had betrayed them. Amara did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She had worked in juvenile psych wards with teenagers who had committed real violence, and she recognized the language of their rage. It was not malice. It was a desperate, terrified scream into the void. She set her bag down with a quiet, deliberate calm, her presence a pool of stillness in the raging current of their pain. She looked past the shattered vase, past the torn music, and directly at the 3 small, hurting boys. "You're trying to tell your Uncle Vincent something, aren't you?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying an unnerving, analytical precision. "You're showing him how loud it feels inside." The boys froze. The rage in their eyes flickered, replaced for a single stunning moment by sheer, unadulterated shock. They had expected her to yell, to threaten, to retreat. They had not expected her to see them. In that instant, Amara Jenkins had not entered a new job. She had entered a crime scene, and the only witnesses were 3 traumatized children who didn't know how to speak. Alexander Sterling lived in a glass house, both literally and metaphorically. His architectural firm was world-renowned for its minimalist, light-filled designs, structures that seemed to float, untethered to the messy earth. His own home was the ultimate expression of this philosophy, a magnificent cantilevered structure jutting out from a Seattle hillside, its walls offering breathtaking, uninterrupted views of the Puget Sound. It was a house designed for a perfect life. But 6 months ago, that life had shattered, and now the glass walls served only to mock him, reflecting back the image of a man adrift in a beautiful, empty vessel. He was a man broken by grief, but he wore his brokenness like armor. The death of his wife, Clara, in what the police had ruled a tragic, accidental fall down the grand, floating staircase, had hollowed him out. Clara had been the home's vibrant, chaotic heart, a brilliant concert pianist whose passionate, joyful music had once filled every room. Now, the silence she left behind was a physical presence, a constant, suffocating weight. Alexander's response was to retreat into the one world he could still control his work. He left before the triplets woke and returned long after they were asleep, communicating with his household staff through a series of terse emails and delegating the emotional labor of parenting to a string of increasingly desperate nannies. He loved his sons with a fierce, terrified love, but their grief was a mirror to his own, and he couldn't bear to look at it. Their explosive, destructive behavior was, in his mind, a symptom of their loss, a chaotic, messy problem that required a firm, logical solution. He just hadn't found the right one yet. He saw them as broken things that needed to be fixed, not as hurting souls that needed to be held. His only tether to his old life, to Clara's world, was her younger brother, Vincent. Vincent had been a constant presence since the accident, a seemingly solid, supportive figure in the chaos. He would come to the house, his face a mask of sorrowful concern, and offer advice. "They need structure. Alex," he would say, his hand resting on Alexander's shoulder. "They need to know who's in charge. You're being too soft on them." Alexander, lost in his own fog of pain and guilt, clung to Vincent's confident assertions like a drowning man to a raft. He didn't have the emotional bandwidth to question him. He didn't see the subtle, predatory gleam in Vincent's eyes when he looked at the expensive art on the walls. He didn't notice the way Vincent would always steer the conversation towards Clara's estate, her assets, the complexities of her will. He was so blinded by his own sorrow that he failed to see that the fox had not just been invited into the henhouse. He had been handed the keys. He was a brilliant architect who could design a flawless building, but he was utterly incapable of seeing the profound structural rot that was beginning to consume his own family from within. Amara Jenkins was a reader of silences, a translator of the languages spoken by the broken. Her last job, the one that had sent her seeking the relative quiet of domestic work, had been as a behavioral analyst for a juvenile forensics unit. She had spent years sitting in sterile interrogation rooms, looking at children who had committed unspeakable acts, and learning to see the original, unhealed wound that lay beneath the scar tissue of their rage. She was an expert in the archaeology of pain. She had left that world after a particularly brutal case, a young girl who had been a witness to a crime so horrific it had stolen her ability to speak. Amara had spent months with her, using art and play to piece together the girl's silent testimony. She had succeeded. The girl's testimony had put a dangerous man behind bars, but the cost had been too high. Amara had absorbed too much of the child's trauma, and her own spirit had begun to fray. She needed a place to heal, a place where the stakes were lower, where a child's tantrum was just a tantrum, not a clue to a felony. The Sterling household, she had thought, would be that place. The agency had described it as a simple case of grieving children acting out, a tragic but straightforward assignment. But from the moment she walked in, her old instincts, the ones she had tried so hard to silence, began to scream. She saw it in the details. The destruction in the living room wasn't random. The boys hadn't just been breaking things, they had been targeting things. Clara's sheet music, her piano, the porcelain figurines she collected, all of it had been systematically destroyed. An act of rage directed specifically at their mother's memory. It wasn't just grief, it was a protest. And then there was Vincent. She observed him during his first visit after her arrival. He was the perfect picture of the grieving, supportive uncle. He brought expensive toys, spoke in soft, concerned tones. But Amara saw the things no one else did. She saw the way the triplets would physically recoil when he entered a room, a subtle, almost imperceptible tensing of their small bodies. She saw the way Leo, the oldest, would position himself between Vincent and his younger brothers, a tiny, silent bodyguard. Most tellingly, she saw their art. In the state-of-the-art playroom, amidst the brightly colored walls and educational toys, was a large easel. The nannies before her had dismissed the boys' drawings as angry, meaningless scribbles, but Amara collected them. She saw the recurring patterns, a tall, dark figure looming over a smaller, brighter one. A drawing of a pearl necklace, its string broken, the pearls scattered like tears. A house where all the windows were colored in with black crayon, except for one, from which 3 small faces peered out. These were not just drawings. They were dispatches from a war zone, a silent, desperate form of testimony. The children were screaming a story, but they were using a language of symbols and actions that everyone else had dismissed as noise. Amara Jenkins, the woman who had come here to escape the world of silent witnesses, found herself in the presence of 3 of the most eloquent ones she had ever met. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she could not walk away. The collision came, as it so often does, disguised as an act of kindness. Vincent Hayes arrived on a drizzly Seattle afternoon, his arms laden with brightly wrapped gifts. He exuded an air of cheerful, benevolent concern, the perfect uncle stepping in to bring a moment of joy to his grieving nephews. Alexander, weary from a sleepless night and another cancelled conference call, greeted him with a palpable sense of relief. "I thought the boys could use a distraction," Vincent said, his smile never quite reaching his cold, watchful eyes. He placed the large, impressive-looking boxes on the floor, the new Astrobot combat arena. All the rage. The triplets, who had been quietly building a block tower with Amara in the corner of the room, looked up. For a moment, a flicker of normal, childish excitement crossed their faces. But as Vincent stepped closer, the light in their eyes extinguished, replaced by a familiar, guarded tension. "Go on, boys," Alexander urged, a desperate note in his voice. "Your uncle brought you a present. Say thank you." The boys remained silent, their bodies a rigid line of resistance. Leo, the eldest, subtly moved to block his brothers from Vincent's direct line of sight. Vincent's smile tightened. He crouched down, forcing himself into their space. "What's the matter? Not in the mood for robots?" He pushed one of the boxes toward Finn, the youngest. "This one has laser cannons." Finn flinched, pulling back as if the box were hot. Noah, the middle child, simply stared at Vincent, his expression one of pure, unadulterated loathing. The rejection was a public and humiliating one. Vincent's performance of the doting uncle was failing. He stood up, his frustration beginning to show. "Alexander, this is what I've been talking about. They're defiant. They need a firmer hand." He turned his attention to Amara, his gaze sharp and accusatory. "And you," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're indulging this behavior. You're letting them run wild. A little discipline is what's required here, not this coddling." Amara met his gaze, her expression calm. "They're not being defiant, Mr. Hayes. They're setting a boundary." The quiet authority in her voice seemed to infuriate him. "A boundary," he scoffed. "They're 6-year-old boys throwing a tantrum. It's your job to control them." He then turned to Alexander, playing his final, most effective card. "Alex, Clara would be heartbroken to see them like this. She believed in manners, in respect. You're letting this woman, a stranger, undermine the very values your wife held dear." The mention of Clara, weaponized and twisted, was a fatal blow. Alexander's face, already etched with exhaustion, crumpled. The guilt, the grief, the overwhelming sense of failure, it all came rushing back. Vincent had found his weak point and pressed on it with surgical cruelty. "He's right," Alexander said, his voice a low, defeated murmur. He couldn't bring himself to look at Amara. He just wanted the confrontation, the crying, the entire, unbearable scene to end. Do as he says. Amara, just get them under control. It was a complete abdication. In that moment, he wasn't a father protecting his children. He was a broken man surrendering to the path of least resistance. He had chosen the confident, easy lies of a predator over the difficult, quiet truth that Amara was trying to show him. The collision was complete. He had sided with the very man his children were trying to warn him about, leaving Amara and the triplets utterly, terrifyingly alone. Faced with a direct order from her employer and the smug, triumphant gaze of Vincent Hayes, Amara did not argue. She did not defend her methods or challenge Alexander's decision. She simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. But it was a nod of acquiescence, not surrender. She turned to the triplets, who were now watching her with wide, fearful eyes, expecting her to transform into the disciplinarian they had been warned about. Instead, she knelt down, bringing herself to their level. She completely ignored the expensive, unopened robot toys. "I have an idea," she said, her voice a soft, conspiratorial whisper that drew them in. "Let's build something loud." Before Alexander or Vincent could react, she led the boys not to the playroom, but to the kitchen. She pulled out a collection of pots and pans, wooden spoons, and metal whisks. "Okay," she announced, her eyes twinkling with a defiant spark. "We need to make some noise. The biggest, angriest noise you can imagine. Let's show the house how you feel." It was an act of pure, unconventional genius. She wasn't suppressing their rage, she was giving it a safe, controlled outlet. For a moment, the boys hesitated, confused. Then Noah, the quietest one, tentatively tapped a wooden spoon against a large stock pot. The resulting bong was a satisfying, resonant sound. A slow grin spread across his face. Leo and Finn quickly followed suit. Within minutes, the pristine, silent kitchen was filled with a cacophony of crashing, banging, and clattering. It was a deafening, chaotic symphony of childhood rage, and Amara was its conductor. She didn't just allow it, she encouraged it, banging a pot lid like a cymbal, laughing as the boys pounded out the furious, frantic rhythm of their unspoken pain. Vincent stood in the doorway, his face a mask of utter horror and disbelief. This was the opposite of control. This was anarchy. "Alexander, are you going to allow this?" he demanded. But Alexander was frozen, watching the scene with a dawning, shocking sense of revelation. He had expected Amara to scold, to discipline, to force the boys into a resentful silence. Instead, she had met their chaos with her own, and in doing so, had performed a kind of magic. For the first time in 6 months, his sons were not just angry, they were expressing their anger, and in their faces, beneath the fierce concentration of their drumming, he saw not malice, but a flicker of pure, unadulterated relief. After a few minutes of thunderous noise, Amara raised her hands. "Okay," she said, her voice cutting through the din. "I think the house heard you." The banging subsided, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The boys were breathing heavily, their faces flushed, their anger seemingly spent. Amara then pulled a large tub of clay onto the kitchen floor. "Now," she said, her voice gentle again, "if you can't say it, let's make it." She gave each boy a lump of the cool, pliable clay. Alexander and Vincent watched, stunned, from the doorway. He had expected her to fail, to be overwhelmed. He had never expected her to succeed in such a strange, bewildering, and undeniably effective way. As he watched his sons, now sitting quietly on the floor, their small hands working the clay with intense focus, a seed of doubt, sharp and persistent, was planted in his mind. Perhaps the problem wasn't that his children were uncontrollable. Perhaps the problem was that no one, until now, had been speaking their language. At that moment, the powerful architect realized the maid might understand the true design of his children's hearts far better than he did. If you believe that sometimes the best way to heal is to first make some noise, give us a like to support Amara's journey, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The chaotic symphony in the kitchen was a turning point for Alexander. It was a language he didn't understand, but the result, 3 calm, focused children after a storm of rage, was an outcome he couldn't ignore. That evening, long after the boys were asleep and the house had returned to its usual, heavy silence, He did something he hadn't done since Clara's death. He began his own investigation. He didn't start with business files or legal documents. He started with the personnel file for Amara Jenkins. He had only glanced at it before, a cursory check handled by his assistant. Now he read every line. He saw the standard, agency-vetted information. But he also saw the attachment she had included with her original application, a letter of intent that no one had likely bothered to read. In it, she didn't talk about her skills in housekeeping or meal preparation. She wrote about her time as a behavioral analyst. She wrote about her belief that behavior is a language, especially for those who have no words for their pain. She wrote about wanting a quieter job, a place to listen instead of analyze. He then accessed her full, unedited background check, which included her employment history with the city's juvenile forensics unit. He saw the name of the last case she had worked on, a high-profile child witness case that had been all over the news a year ago. He had followed it peripherally, a story of a silent, traumatized girl and the anonymous city employee who had patiently helped her testify through drawings. That employee, he now realized, had been Amara. The woman he had hired to clean his house had a background in deciphering the very kind of silent trauma that was tearing his family apart. It wasn't a coincidence. It felt like a quiet, cosmic intervention. His investigation then turned to his own home. He began to look, really look, at the clues his sons had been leaving for him. He went into the playroom and gathered the drawings Amara had saved. He laid them out on the vast, empty dining room table. Seen together, they were not random scribbles. They were a narrative. The tall, dark figure appeared in almost everyone, always menacing, always looming over the smaller, brighter figures of a woman and 3 small boys. He then did what Amara had done. He started to observe. The next day, he worked from home, a rarity. He watched as the triplets played. He noticed that their games, which had seemed like meaningless chaos, often had a recurring theme, a monster trying to break into a castle where 3 small princes and a queen were hiding. He noticed that whenever Vincent's car pulled into the driveway, Finn, the youngest, would run and hide in the same closet. Every single time. The data points were accumulating, forming a pattern that was both terrifying and undeniable. His children weren't just grieving, they were scared, and their fear seemed to have a name and a face, their Uncle Vincent. Alexander felt a cold, sickening dread creeping into his heart. He was a man who built his life on solid foundations, on blueprints and logic. But the foundations of his own family were shifting beneath his feet, revealing a dark, hidden chamber he had never known existed. Alexander found Amara in the garden, a small, sheltered space Clara had designed, now slightly overgrown from months of neglect. She was kneeling in the dirt with the triplets, a basket of freshly pulled weeds beside them. She was showing them how to tell the difference between a weed and a new sprout. Her voice, a low, patient murmur. It was the first time he had seen the garden tended to since Clara's passing. He waited until the boys, bored with the lesson, had run off to chase a butterfly. "Amara," he said, approaching her. "We need to talk." They sat on a cold stone bench, the scent of damp earth and crushed mint from the weeds hanging in the air. He didn't know how to begin. All his life, he had been the one with the answers, the one who gave the orders. Now, He was a man asking for a map in a foreign country. "Your file," he started, his voice awkward. "I read it. The forensics unit. The work you did with silent witnesses." Amara didn't seem surprised. She simply nodded, her gaze fixed on a small, determined sprout pushing its way through the hard soil. That was a different life. "Mr. Sterling." "Was it?" he countered. "Because what you are doing here, with my sons, it feels the same. You see things. You understand things. I need you to tell me what you see." She was silent for a long moment, her hands resting in her lap, her fingers still smudged with dirt. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried the weight of her past. "When I was with the unit," she began, "they taught us that trauma isn't a memory. It's a reenactment. A person who has been through something terrible doesn't just remember it. They relive it, often without knowing. They recreate the dynamics of the trauma in their everyday lives." She looked at him then, her eyes clear and direct. "Your sons are not just breaking things, Mr. Sterling. They are reenacting a moment of profound violence and powerlessness. The destruction, the screaming, the targeting of their mother's things. It is the only way they know how to tell you what they saw." She told him then about the case that had broken her, the one that had sent her seeking refuge in the quiet anonymity of domestic work. A 7-year-old girl who had witnessed her father's violent robbery had gone completely mute. For months, she communicated nothing. The police had no leads. Everyone tried to get her to talk. Amara recounted. Therapists, detectives, child psychologists. They all asked her, "What did you see?" But that was the wrong question. The trauma had stolen her words, so I stopped asking. I just watched. Amara had spent weeks simply sitting with the girl, playing with dolls, and she noticed that in their games, the girl would always have the daddy doll hide a shiny red toy car, the color of the getaway car, under a blanket before the monster doll would come and smash the dollhouse. She wasn't telling me what happened, Amara explained. She was showing me. Her play was her testimony. Your sons, she concluded, her voice gentle but firm, are giving their testimony every single day. In their drawings, in their games, in their rage. The question is whether anyone is willing to read it. In that quiet garden, surrounded by the ghosts of his wife's flowers. Alexander finally understood. He had been trying to manage a crisis, but Amara was deciphering a code. Her secret wasn't just a past job. It was a profound, almost sacred ability to listen to the language of pain, and she was offering to teach it to him. Amara's explanation was the key that unlocked the dark room of Alexander's denial. He began to see his son's behavior not as an indictment of his parenting, but as a desperate coded message. Armed with this new lens, he started to connect the dots, and the picture that emerged was more horrifying than he could have imagined. The pearl necklace, the broken string, the drawing Noah had made. He remembered it now with a jolt of ice-cold clarity. It was Clara's favorite, a classic strand of Akoya pearls that had been a gift from her grandmother. She wore it constantly. After her death, in the haze of his grief, He had noticed it was missing, but he had assumed it had been lost in the chaos of the accident, perhaps taken by the paramedics, a detail too small to focus on in the face of such overwhelming loss. Now, that missing necklace became the focal point of his investigation. That night, after the house was silent, he did something he had been avoiding for 6 months. He went to the base of the grand floating staircase where Clara had died. The police had cleaned the scene, but in his mind, it was still stained with the tragedy. He knelt on the cold, polished floor, his fingers tracing the seams where the hardwood met the wall. He ran his hand under the lip of the bottom step, a place a vacuum cleaner could never reach. His fingers closed around something small and hard. He pulled it out. It was a single, perfect pearl, nestled in a small collection of dust and lint. His heart hammered against his ribs. He stood up and looked around the vast, open-plan living room. If the necklace had broken, where would the rest of the pearls have gone? He began to search, his movements frantic at first, then slow and methodical. He looked under the sofa cushions, behind the heavy drapes. Nothing. Then he remembered the drawings, the tall, dark figure, the way the boys always targeted their uncle's portrait. He walked to the ornate, built-in bookshelf that flanked the fireplace. On one of the lower shelves was a large decorative ceramic urn, a piece Vincent had given them as a housewarming gift years ago. Alexander had always hated it. It was ostentatious, out of place among their minimalist decor. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled amongst the decorative dried branches, was the rest of the broken strand, a tangled, lifeless coil of silk and pearls. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Vincent had been here. He must have been here the day Clara died. There must have been a struggle, a fight violent enough to break a sturdy pearl necklace. And then, he had hidden the evidence in plain sight, in the very gift he had once given them. The trap was not a business conspiracy, it was a murder, expertly disguised as a tragic accident. The police had seen no signs of forced entry, no obvious weapon. Vincent, as a family member, had the perfect alibi for being present. He had played the part of the grieving brother so perfectly that no one, least of all Alexander, had thought to question his presence. He had manipulated Alexander's grief, using it as a shield to hide his own monstrous crime. Alexander sank to the floor, the broken necklace clutched in his hand, the carefully constructed walls of his world crumbling into dust. The truth that his sons had been trying to scream at him for 6 months had finally been unearthed. And it was a truth that would demand a terrible, long overdue justice. Alexander's discovery of the broken necklace was a silent declaration of war. He did not confront Vincent immediately. He was an architect, a man who understood that a solid case, like a solid building, required a perfect foundation. He spent the next 48 hours in a state of cold, controlled fury, gathering his evidence, his grief now sharpened into the edge of a weapon. He documented the hidden pearl, photographed the necklace in the urn, and, with Amara's guidance, began to catalogue the triplets' drawings and behaviors, building a timeline that was becoming more damning by the hour. But Vincent was a predator, attuned to the subtlest shifts in his environment. He sensed the change in Alexander immediately. The phone calls that were once answered with weary resignation were now met with a cool, professional distance. The invitations to dinner were politely but firmly declined. Alexander was no longer a passive, grieving man. He was an adversary. And Vincent, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, launched a vicious, preemptive strike. The attack came through a channel Alexander had never thought to protect his children's school. Vincent, in his guise as the concerned, loving uncle, scheduled a private meeting with the headmaster of the prestigious private academy the Triplets attended. He painted a heartbreaking picture of a family in crisis. He spoke of Alexander's erratic behavior, his obsessive focus on conspiracy theories surrounding his wife's death, and, most poisonously, his decision to place the boys in the care of a new, unqualified nanny with a questionable background. "He's not thinking clearly," Vincent said, his voice a masterpiece of feigned concern. "He's letting this woman, a stranger, fill his head with these wild, damaging ideas. The boys are more disruptive than ever. I'm worried for their stability, for their safety." He was not just discrediting Alexander. He was laying the groundwork to have Amara removed, severing the one link Alexander had to the truth. The school, legally obligated to respond to such concerns, scheduled a formal parent-teacher administrator conference. Alexander was summoned to a meeting where he found himself on the defensive, his own parental judgment being called into question. But Vincent's masterstroke was even more insidious. He knew Alexander's greatest vulnerability was not his company or his reputation, but his deep-seated fear of failing as a father. Vincent anonymously placed a call to Child Protective Services. The call was a work of artful manipulation. He described a home in turmoil, a grieving, unstable father, and 3 out-of-control children being cared for by a woman with no official credentials. He didn't make wild accusations. He simply expressed deep concern, planting a seed of official suspicion that he knew would grow into a thorny, invasive weed. The counterattack was brilliant in its cruelty. Vincent was using the very systems designed to protect children as a weapon to silence them. He was turning Alexander's love for his sons into a liability, forcing him to fight a battle on 2 fronts, one for the truth of his wife's death, and another for the right to keep his own children. He was isolating Alexander, discrediting his only ally, and positioning himself as the only stable, rational adult in a world of chaos. The villain was not just fighting back. He was trying to burn the entire house down, with the witnesses still inside. The summons from Child Protective Services was a blow that nearly shattered Alexander's newfound resolve. It was a bureaucratic nightmare, a threat that struck at the very core of his identity as a father. He was now facing the terrifying possibility that his children, the only thing that mattered, could be taken from him. He was a man accustomed to fighting hostile takeovers and navigating complex contracts. But this was a war of whispers and innuendo, a battle he didn't know how to fight. He sat in his study, the official letter from CPS on his desk, feeling the walls closing in. He was about to be investigated by a system that was notoriously slow, impersonal, and often biased against single fathers. Vincent's trap was perfect, but he was no longer alone. When Amara saw the letter, she didn't show fear or panic. Her expression was one of grim, focused determination. "This is what they do," she said, her voice a low, steady hum that cut through his anxiety. When they can't win on facts, they attack the messenger. They try to make you the problem. She then made a call that changed the course of the entire conflict. Her ally was not a high-powered lawyer or a private investigator. It was a woman named Maria Flores, a social worker she had known for years from her time in the juvenile justice system. Maria wasn't a supervisor or a director. She was a veteran caseworker, a woman who had spent 20 years in the trenches, who had a reputation for being fiercely protective of children and possessing a near supernatural ability to see through bureaucratic lies. "Maria," Amara said when the woman answered, "I need a favor. I need an honest set of eyes on a case." 2 days later, when the doorbell rang, it was not a stern, judgmental investigator who stood on the doorstep, but Maria Flores. She was a woman in her 50s, with kind, weary eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She greeted Alexander with a firm handshake and a direct, appraising gaze. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice leaving no room for pleasantries. "I've read the report filed by your brother-in-law. It paints a concerning picture. Now, I'd like to see the reality." Maria's investigation was not the cold, clinical assessment Alexander had feared. She was an unexpected ally, an expert from within the very system that had been weaponized against them. She didn't just interview Alexander, she spoke with the triplets, not with leading questions, but with a gentle, patient curiosity. She didn't see 3 out-of-control boys. She saw 3 children struggling to communicate a profound trauma. She watched as Amara led the boys in a session of art therapy, the same technique she had been using for weeks. Maria saw the recurring images in their drawings, the dark figure, the broken necklace. As a trained professional, she recognized these not as random fantasies, but as classic, textbook examples of post-traumatic play. But her most crucial contribution came when she reviewed the initial police report of Clara's death, a document Alexander had been too grief-stricken to examine closely. Maria, with her caseworker's eye for detail, found a small, overlooked inconsistency. "Here," she said, pointing to a line in the responding officer's notes. The initial call was logged as a domestic disturbance. A neighbor reported sounds of a heated argument, but the final report lists the cause of death as an accidental fall. Why was the initial report of an argument never followed up on? Who made the decision to change the nature of the investigation? It was a small thread, but Maria knew that small threads, when pulled, could unravel entire tapestries of deceit. She wasn't just a social worker anymore. She had become their co-investigator, an unexpected ally who knew how to navigate the very system Vincent was trying to use against them. She provided the official credibility and the procedural knowledge they desperately needed. The tide was beginning to turn. Maria Flores's discovery of the downgraded police report was the crack in the foundation of Vincent's story. It provided the official justification they needed to dig deeper, to push back against the narrative of a simple, tragic accident. With Maria's guidance, Alexander hired a tenacious private investigator, a former homicide detective who specialized in cold cases. The investigator, a grizzled man named Frank Miller, focused on one thing: the timeline of the day Clara died. He re-interviewed the neighbors. He tracked down the 2 police officers who had first responded to the scene. One of them, now retired, remembered the call vividly. Yeah, it felt off. The retired officer told Miller over a cup of coffee. The brother, Vincent. He was there when we arrived. He was the one who insisted it was just a fall, that his sister had been drinking. He was almost too calm, too eager to provide an explanation. The husband was a complete wreck, couldn't even speak. We took the brother's word for it. Looking back, maybe we shouldn't have. The pieces were falling into place, but they still lacked a direct, undeniable link, the final piece of evidence that could transform suspicion into a criminal charge. That evidence, as it so often does, came from the children. Amara, with Maria's full support, decided to stage a more structured, formal therapeutic art session. It would be recorded, with Alexander's permission, as part of the official CPS case file. It was not an interrogation, but an invitation for the boys to tell their story in the one language they felt safe using. She set up 3 small easels in the quiet sunroom, the gentle Seattle rain pattering against the glass roof. "Today," she said to Leo, Noah, and Finn, her voice a soft, calming presence, "I want you to paint the scariest day you can remember, the day the house felt the loudest." She did not mention their mother. She did not mention the fall. She simply gave them the colors and the space. For nearly an hour, the boys worked in a state of intense, silent concentration. Alexander and Maria watched from an adjoining room via a small, discreet camera. What they saw was heartbreaking and profound. The boys were not just painting, they were testifying. And their testimonies, while rendered in the innocent, clumsy strokes of a child's hand, were identical in their core details. All 3 paintings depicted the grand, floating staircase. All 3 showed a bright, vibrant female figure at the top, their mother, Clara, unmistakable in her favorite yellow dress. And at the bottom of the stairs, in all 3 paintings, was a tall, dark, menacing male figure, their Uncle Vincent. But it was the small, specific details that were the most damning. Leo's painting showed the woman and the man in a heated argument. He had drawn jagged, angry red lines between their mouths, and in the woman's hand he had painted a small black rectangle, a cell phone. Noah's painting focused on a single, shocking moment of violence. The dark figure's arm was outstretched, pushing the bright figure, and flying through the air was a string of white dots with a broken line, the pearl necklace, captured in the moment of its breaking. But it was Finn's painting, the painting of the youngest, most withdrawn child. That was the final, devastating piece of evidence. His painting showed the woman lying at the bottom of the stairs. The dark figure was standing over her, and in the dark figure's hand was the same small, black rectangle from Leo's painting. He was putting it in his pocket, and around the woman's head. Finn had used a single, horrifying color. He had painted her tears not with blue, but with a bright, shocking red. Alexander stared at the screen, a strangled sob caught in his throat. It was all there, the argument. The phone Clara must have been trying to call for help, or perhaps even record Vincent. The push, the broken necklace, the theft of the phone after she fell, and the red tears, a child's devastating, literal interpretation of a fatal head wound. It was no longer a suspicion. It was no longer a theory. It was a complete, corroborated narrative of a murder, told in triplicate by its only witnesses. This was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. This was the truth that would finally set them free. The stage for the final confrontation was not a courtroom, but the cold, sterile conference room of a family law office. Vincent had initiated the meeting, a power play designed to formalize his petition for guardianship and to put Alexander on the defensive in front of a mediator. He walked in with a confident, predatory swagger, his lawyer by his side, ready to deliver the killing blow to what he believed was a broken, unstable family. He expected to find a defeated Alexander and a flustered Nanny. He found a firing squad. Alexander was there, but the defeated, grieving man was gone, replaced by a figure of cold, unshakable resolve. Beside him sat Amara, her presence a quiet, solid testament to the truth she had unearthed. And on their other side sat Maria Flores from CPS, her presence an official sanction, and Frank Miller, the grizzled private investigator, his briefcase a silent promise of the evidence within. Vincent's confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second as he took in the scene, but he recovered quickly. "Alexander," he began, his voice oozing with false sympathy. "I'm glad we can finally discuss this like rational adults. This is all for the good of the boys, you understand?" Alexander didn't respond. He simply looked at Frank Miller and gave a slight nod. Miller didn't speak. He opened his briefcase and, with the deliberate calm of a seasoned detective, placed a single glossy photograph in the center of the polished table. It was a high-resolution image of Finn's painting, the woman in the yellow dress, the dark figure standing over her, the phone in his hand, and the terrible, eloquent red tears. Vincent stared at the painting, his face draining of all color. It was as if he were looking at a photograph of his own soul. "What is this?" he stammered, his voice losing its confident edge. "Childish scribbles." "This is your proof. It's their testimony," Amara said, her voice cutting through the room, clear and steady. "And they are very, very consistent witnesses." Miller then laid out a second photograph, this one of Noah's painting, showing the push and the broken necklace, and then a third, of Leo's painting, showing the argument. He placed them side by side, a triptych of a murder. "My client," Miller said, his gravelly voice directed at Vincent's now panicked lawyer, "also recovered this." He placed a small, clear evidence bag on the table. Inside was the tangled, broken strand of Clara's pearl necklace. Vincent's facade finally shattered. "This is insane," he blurted out, his voice rising. "You're twisting the grief of 3 small children into some fantasy, Alex. Tell them. Tell them how much I've helped, how I've been there for you." Alexander met his brother-in-law's desperate gaze, and his eyes were like chips of ice. "You were there," he said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. "You were there when she fell. You were there when her necklace broke. And you were there to take her phone after you pushed her." The curtain had not just been pulled back, it had been torn to shreds. Vincent, stripped of his mask of the concerned uncle, was revealed for what he was, a murderer, exposed by the very children he thought were too small, too broken, to ever betray him. He looked from the paintings to the necklace, to the cold, unforgiving faces around the table, and he knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that the game was over. Vincent Hayes was a man who had built his life on a foundation of calculated risks and other people's money. He was a gambler at heart, and he had just played his final, desperate hand and lost. For a moment, he tried to bluff, his mind scrambling for an escape route, a lie, a plausible denial. "This is a character assassination," he snarled, pointing a shaking finger at Amara. "She has been poisoning them against me, planting these ideas in their heads." But his lawyer, a man who understood the difference between a defensible case and a sinking ship, slowly placed a hand on his arm. "Vincent," he said, his voice a low, defeated murmur. "Don't." It was then that the conference room door opened. Two uniformed Seattle police detectives stepped inside. They didn't speak. Their presence was a statement in itself, a silent, official confirmation that this was no longer a family dispute. It was a criminal investigation. One of the detectives looked at Vincent, his expression impassive. "Vincent Hayes," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the death of Clara Sterling." The collapse was total. The fight drained out of Vincent, replaced by a grey, ashen shock. He slumped in his chair, a puppet with its strings cut. The justice he had evaded for 6 long months had finally arrived, not with a dramatic courtroom showdown, but here, in this quiet, sterile office, delivered by the silent, crayon-rendered testimony of his own nephews. As the detectives read him his rights and cuffed his hands behind his back, he didn't resist. He was led from the room, a shell of the confident, manipulative man who had walked in just an hour before. His last, desperate glance was at Alexander, a look that was not of anger, but of a strange, pleading bewilderment, as if he still couldn't comprehend how his perfect plan had so completely unraveled. In the heavy silence that followed his departure, Alexander finally let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 6 months. He looked at Amara, the gratitude in his eyes too profound for words. She had not just saved his family, she had restored his faith in the very possibility of truth. The legal justice that followed was a formality. Faced with the children's corroborated testimony, the recovered evidence of the necklace, and the testimony of the retired police officer, Vincent's defense crumbled. He was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. But the more profound justice was the one that unfolded within the walls of the Sterling mansion. The house, once a place of haunted silences and explosive rage, began to heal. The boys, finally freed from the terrible burden of their secret, began to talk. They talked about their mother, not just about her death, but about her life, her music, her laughter, her love. The violent drawings were replaced with pictures of suns and flowers and a happy, smiling family. The monster was gone, and in his absence, the light was finally allowed back in. The justice they had all fought for was not just about putting a killer behind bars. It was about giving 3 small boys back their childhood. With Vincent's conviction, a long, dark chapter in the Sterling family's life finally closed. But the end of the legal battle was the beginning of a different, more intricate journey, the process of rebuilding. The house was no longer a crime scene, but the emotional architecture of the family needed to be redesigned from the foundation up. The change was not immediate, but it was profound. The chaotic, explosive anger of the triplets slowly subsided, replaced by the quieter, more complex landscape of genuine grief. There were still difficult days, moments of sadness that would ambush them in the middle of a happy afternoon. But now they had a language for their pain, and they had a father who was learning, day by day, how to listen. Alexander Sterling transformed. He delegated the day-to-day operations of his firm to a trusted partner, his relentless ambition now rechanneled into a new, more vital project, his family. He learned the rhythms of his sons' lives, their favorite bedtime stories, their irrational fear of thunderstorms, the specific way Leo liked his sandwiches cut. He was no longer a visitor in his own home. He was its heart, a steady, present, and deeply engaged father. And Amara was the architect of this new world. She was no longer just the nanny. She was the family's anchor, their guide, their emotional cornerstone. She worked with Alexander and the boys' therapists to create a home environment that was not just safe, but actively healing. But Alexander knew that her role, as vital as it was not her ultimate purpose. He saw the brilliance in her, the profound, intuitive understanding of human behavior that had saved them all, and he knew it was a gift that was meant to be shared with the world. One evening, after the boys were asleep, he found her in the living room, sketching in a notebook. She was designing a new layout for the playroom, creating designated quiet zones and expressive art stations. "Amara," he said, sitting across from her, "I want to talk to you about your future." She looked up, a cautious expression in her eyes. "What you have done for my family," he began, his voice filled with a sincerity that was still new to him, "is a miracle. But your gift is too big to be confined to one house, to one family. There are other children out there, other silent witnesses who need someone who speaks their language." He slid a thick, professionally bound proposal across the coffee table. The title on the cover read, "The Clara Sterling Foundation for Child Advocacy." My wife. Clara believed in giving a voice to the voiceless, Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to create a foundation in her name. A foundation that will fund and develop innovative, art-based therapeutic programs for children who have witnessed trauma. It will train social workers, police officers, and legal guardians in the very methods you use. It will be a place that listens to children when no one else will." He looked at her, his request both a plea and an offering. "I can provide the funding, Amara. I can build the buildings. But I can't provide the soul. Only you can do that. I want you to be its founding director. I want you to take what you did for my sons and build it into a legacy that can help thousands." The new dawn that was breaking was not just for the Sterling family. It was for Amara herself. The quiet, thankless work she had done in the shadows was now being offered a platform, a chance to shine a light into the darkest corners of other children's lives. It was a future she had never dared to imagine, a purpose that had been forged in the crucible of her own quiet, resilient strength. The Clara Sterling Foundation for Child Advocacy did not launch with a glittering gala or a high-profile press conference. It opened its doors 1 year later with a quiet, joyful community open house. The building, a beautifully renovated historic brownstone in a family-friendly Seattle neighborhood, was filled with the sound of children's laughter, the smell of fresh paint, and the warm, hopeful hum of a new beginning. Amara Jenkins, as the Foundation's executive director, moved through the crowded rooms with a calm, assured grace. She was no longer the anonymous nanny, but a respected leader in the field of child psychology. Her innovative, art-based methods already being hailed as revolutionary. She greeted parents, hugged children, and spoke with therapists. Her presence a beacon of compassionate authority. Alexander Sterling was there, not as the billionaire benefactor, but simply as a proud co-founder and a devoted father. He stood near the back, watching the scene unfold, his 3 sons by his side. Leo, Noah, and Finn were no longer the wild, angry boys who had once terrorized a string of nannies. They were bright, engaging, and remarkably empathetic 7-year-olds, moving through the crowd to show other children the painting wall or the clay volcano room. They had become the Foundation's first and most powerful success story. Later in the afternoon, Amara stood to give a brief, heartfelt speech. She spoke of the Foundation's mission to listen to the stories that children tell not with their words, but with their hearts, their art, and their actions. Every child, she concluded, her eyes finding Alexander and the boys in the crowd, deserves to be heard. Every child deserves to be believed. And every child deserves to know that even after the darkest storm, the sun will rise again. As the crowd applauded, Alexander caught her eye and gave her a small, grateful smile. Theirs was not a story of romance. It had evolved into something deeper, a partnership built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared loss, and a powerful, unified purpose. They were family, a unique and modern one, bound together by the 3 small boys they had both, in their own ways, saved. The legacy they were building was not one of cold, hard architecture or corporate power. It was a living, breathing legacy of healing. It was the legacy of Clara, whose love for her children had, in the end, been the force that brought the truth to light. It was the legacy of Amara, whose quiet strength and profound empathy had turned a house of pain into a home of hope. And it was the legacy of Alexander, a man who had been brave enough to confront his own failings and transform his grief into a powerful force for good. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow through the windows of the Foundation, Amara found the triplets in the garden, gathered around a small, newly planted magnolia tree. "This is Mama's tree," Leo explained to her, his small hand resting on the smooth bark, "so she can watch us play." Amara knelt beside them, a lump forming in her throat. The story that had begun with an act of terrible violence had ended here, in a garden of peace. The rage was gone, replaced by remembrance. The silence was gone, replaced by the hopeful whispers of a new generation. The house of cards had fallen, but in its place they had built something real, something that would last.